Join us as we dive into the history, hauntings, and high strangeness of the world to try to better understand the paranormal. I will be your guide. I am paranormal researcher and investigator Eric Freeman Sims. Welcome to the Unseen Paranormal Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Unseen Paranormal Podcast. I am your host, Eric, as usual. Thanks for tuning in today. We have a great guest for you, Mr. Steve Causey. We are talking about his book, The LBL Massacre, up in the land between the lakes, which spans between Kentucky and Tennessee and dammed up two of the rivers to make Kentucky Lake, which a lot of people have heard of, and Lake Barkley. And so we're going to chat about Dogmen up there and a massacre that was covered up by our government and military and the local law enforcement. But before we get to that, I want to talk about taking mental health time for yourself, because I think our lives get way too busy sometimes. And I have to remind myself of this too. And everything I talk to y'all about, this is just my opinions on things and the way that I've come to look at things over my 41 years on this earth. But even I forget to take mental health days for myself. And we get so busy in life and we say yes so many times. A lot of us say yes to everything because we want to try to, I don't know, not please everybody, I don't think is a thing, but we want to be there for our friends and family and try to do everything for everybody that we can. And sometimes it just gets taxing, and you need to take mental health days for yourself and just take a rest, even if it's just sleeping all day. And that's okay. Like, it's okay just to let yourself sleep all day. I kind of find myself beating myself up if I just want to sleep in the mornings because I feel like I'm wasting the day. Or if I take a mental health day on a Sunday or something, I feel like I'm wasting the day because I have so much to do with podcasts and with video stuff I got going on and working on the book and all the things that I have going on. And then all the other things, like I'm part of the Favorite Arts Council now. I'm a board member and I have all these things going on. And I just feel like if I take a day off, that I'm being lazy and I have to get out of that mindset and just give myself a break and say, hey, it is okay if I take a day off. Fuck. Like, you know, I work my ass off all the time. I deserve a day off every once in a while and not feel guilty about it either. So been working on that here lately of trying to take at least one day to where if I want to fucking sleep all day, I just sleep all day. If I want to play video games, play video games, and I don't feel guilty about it. So it's okay to take mental health days and just not be available to people on that day. Just say, no, this is my day to do nothing, to just recharge my batteries and rest. And that's what I've been working on here lately. So hopefully that resonates with some of y'all. I'm done with my rant for today. I thank y'all for listening. And let's get on to Mr. Steve Causey, author of the LBL Massacre, talking about spooky dogmen tearing people apart. These are reasons, folks. I'm telling you again, this is why I don't camp. This entire episode is why I don't camp. So enjoy. And thank you for listening. We'll talk to you next time. All right. Hey, Steve, thanks for coming on the show today and joining us.
Glad to be here.
So you have a book out about land between the lakes and the high strangeness up in that area. And like we were just talking, I've been a Tennessee native, Middle Tennessee native my whole life, and never realized until a couple of years ago, I went to a Dogman cryptid conference in Paris, Tennessee. And that's when I found out that land between the lakes had a huge Dogman and Bigfoot connection and things going on up there. So how did you get into the topic and come to write your book?
Well, to be honest with you, I had heard the story many years ago, actually back in 1998 while I was on a fishing trip. And I was initially very skeptical of the story that I heard, just kind of dismissed it. But later on, as I got older and I retired here in 2020, I got to doing a little research on this and discovered that there were credible witnesses and that seemed to have knowledge of the subject. One of the most credible witnesses that has come out in the last few years is a gentleman who is a retired police officer. His name is Martin Groves, and he's actually written a book. It's called Beasts Between the Rivers. And in that book, he tells the event that happened to him back in 1993. He and his police officer friend, deputy sheriff friend, were actually surrounded by creatures that seemed to have a dog-like head, and they barely escaped with their lives. They literally had to shoot their way out. That same day, a gentleman down there that Martin had actually met, who was a firefighter, had actually been killed. His partially eaten body had been dragged about 200 yards or 150 yards from his tent, which had been ripped open.
Oh, wow.
And after talking to credible people like Martin and doing as much research as I could, and that's one thing good about the cryptid community is I found they're very open. They're usually very honest people. They just want the truth.
Yeah.
And so, as I mentioned, I started doing as much research as I could. I pretty much became convinced the story I heard back over 20 years ago was probably true. And so I based my book on the story I had heard, along with a little research, from everyone that I had talked to and interviewed, and created this book. I thought it would be very interesting for people not familiar with the story of the LBL Massacre in the Upper Peninsula of the Land Between the Lakes. I'm not the first person to write about this story. To my knowledge, I am the first person to make this the centerpiece of their book with stories surrounding it.
Yeah. And for people out there listening that don't know, Land Between the Lakes is a national recreation area, and it spans between Tennessee and Kentucky. And there's a Tennessee entrance and Kentucky entrance. And the Tennessee Valley Authority, who was charged with flood control and making hydroelectric dams, dammed up the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River. So that makes up Kentucky Lake and Lake Barkley. And then Land Between the Lakes is the peninsula strip of land in between the two lakes. And I believe it's actually the biggest inland peninsula in the world.
It's in the United States.
Okay.
It's the largest inland peninsula in the United States. It basically goes all the way from a little town on the south side in Tennessee, which is called Dover, Tennessee, all the way up to what's called Cuttawa, Kentucky. People have a different ways of pronouncing that. That's the way I pronounce it. I've heard it both a couple of different ways. And so this is a pretty expansive territory. It's a little bit less than 200,000 square acres of land. This originally was populated, as I explained in my book. I was actually originally, back in the first grade when my father retired from the Army, I was a resident of the lower end of the peninsula down what's near a place called Fort Henry. Fort Henry was the western defenses of the Confederate Army during the Civil War, but it was built too low. It was almost underwater when they had the gunboats come down on the Tennessee side, and so it was quickly overwhelmed. The Barkley side, which is now Barkley Lake, these used to be rivers back up until 1943, and it was called the Land Between the Rivers. But in 1963, John Kennedy made the area a recreational area, and all the residents were required to move out. So back in 1964, I believe it was late 64, early 65, there were residents that were down there, including my father, my family, and myself, were forced to move out of the area and relocate. The TVA gave a certain amount of money. It was not a great amount of money you got for your house you built or whatever you put down there. And my father had literally just built a home in 1960 after he retired down near what is now called, it's a little bit north of Lost Creek. That's an area that's where my family was actually came from. There's a place called Causey Holler down there, and a place called Wofford Hollow. Well, my mother's maiden name was Wofford, and my dad, of course, his name was Causey, and he met her, shortly after the war, and they got married. He had actually known her when she was younger, but after he had returned from World War II, they got married. So that was in 1945, and so I became a boomer baby, needless to say.
Yeah.
But the area has a history of strange events going on. As I mentioned, and I speak about in my book, the Shawnee Indians back in the 1600s had warned French settlers which were coming in the area. Now, the Shawnee had a little bit of a tale themselves. They had come into conflict with the Cherokee tribes in North Carolina, and they moved further west. And, of course, you have to remember back in the 1600s, there was no United States. This was just new land and new territory. So west would have been considered Tennessee and areas like that, Kentucky, southern Kentucky. But these Indians had warned the French settlers that there are certain areas, the French trappers primarily, they called them the long guns because they had the long-barreled flint loaders. And so these French trappers were called the long guns by the Shawnee Indians. But they had warned them there were certain areas in southern Kentucky, which were in this area near the Tennessee River at that time, and not to go into these areas. And the reason they gave them was the French translation being loup-garou. Loup-garou means wolf man. And a lot of these French settlers just ignored the Indians. They thought, well, this must be a really good trapping area to go in if they're trying to keep us out of it.
Yeah.
And a lot of these French trappers were never heard from again. They actually found bodies of a couple of them that were mutilated and, partially eaten. So the history goes back a pretty good amount of time that maybe there was an unknown predator in this area that the French stumbled into, and the Shawnee Indians were trying to warn them about. There have been many tales in the early 70s and even the late 60s, and tales from even the 1950s of a creature being spotted that had the dog-like head but a human-like torso. And it ran on all fours, but would also stand up and would, not necessarily attack people, but had been known to kill cattle and livestock in the area for many years. So, some people have theorized that this might be some kind of animal which was genetically manipulated by the Army or someone else, the federal government. But the history for this animal goes back before DNA manipulation would have been possible. We didn't have that technology at that time.
Yeah, and I want everybody to know that this area of land, I mean, this is a place that you can go and hike trails and never come across another person. I mean, this is expansive land of forest. And I always found it really, really creepy. And I don't know why I find this creepy, but where they made people move out, you can be driving down some of these back roads inland between the lakes, and you'll just see a stairway to nowhere, or like a chimney, or even like a group of like buttercups and irises where somebody's mailbox used to be. And there's all these places like that. There's all these old cemeteries out there as well, where people had settled there for a long, long time. And then, like you said, they were forced out, like your family was as well. And it just makes for a little more eerie atmosphere, I think, when you see these remnants of people's homes that they were forced out of.
Right. And this happened actually twice. The area before they flooded the rivers in the early 1940s to make what is the land between the lakes, and to add hydroelectric to the area, which, really improved the situation for a lot of residents and everything. there were residents in what is now Kentucky Lake and also what is now Barkley Lake, which were forced to initially move. There weren't as many residents at that time, but many had to move off the riverbanks and move further inland in the peninsula so as to allow for the expansion of the hydroelectric dams, the building of those and everything. I had originally, and I've heard this from a good source, of course I cannot disclose that source, but this is somebody that I trust that would have had knowledge of it.
Yeah.
That the original intention of the land between the lakes was they were going to build a large breeder reactor down in there and use both rivers to cool it. And this is why the land was originally taken. Now, there's no proof of this or anything, but the person that I have spoken with would have had direct knowledge of this. And, he's a credible witness and I believe his story. But for whatever reason, this was put on the back burner or just completely dismissed. They decided not to build the breeder reactor there. And so it has a history of people being displaced from the property, which goes back to the 1940s. And so a smaller amount of people were displaced in the 1940s who had to move further into the peninsula because of the expansion of the rivers. My father actually had swam across the Tennessee River when he was young. He was a very good swimmer because he would swim the river. It was a lot narrower then.
Yeah.
And, of course, with the lake and everything, there's no way, unless you're a really good, like one of these professional swimmers, that you could swim across the lake because in areas it's well over 2 miles wide, with the Kentucky Lake is. But actually, that would turn out to save his life when he landed on Omaha Beach because he literally had to swim in because his half track was stranded in the water out some distance from the beach. But that was a good thing because he learned how to swim real good down on the Kentucky Lake. So,
yeah.
Or Kentucky, what would have been the Tennessee River at that time, should I say, which is now Kentucky Lake. But the story of the massacre is pretty well known. It supposedly occurred up in the near a small town called Grand Rivers, Kentucky, which is on the upper end of the peninsula. And the story, as I heard it, was that a young couple had found a camper with several dead people around it. These people were not just dead. There was actually a family. It was a mother, a father, and a young boy and a girl, which was discovered later. The father had literally had his arms removed and kind of tossed to one side, either bitten off or pulled off, and a combination of both. And he was severely mutilated. The purported story also includes the mother inside the camper as having put up a real good fight, but this was obviously a fight she wasn't going to win. There was blood on the inside and blood on the outside of the camper. The young couple that had seen the carnage refused to go back in with the deputy sheriffs that were alerted. They had come to a payphone. And keep in mind, this was 1982. Cell phones weren't available at that time.
Yeah.
They were just beginning processes of being developed. But this young couple went to a payphone in Grand Rivers, Kentucky, and called the authorities. And the deputies met with them. They wanted them to initially escort them back to the area. But this young couple was so frightened they refused to go back in with the deputies, but they were able to tell them where they had seen this incident. The deputies arrived at the scene and saw this horrible carnage, and they didn't know what it caused it. Of course, about that time, as I heard the story, state units began to arrive and rescue squad, ambulances. But it was obvious that the ambulance wouldn't be needed because everyone at the scene was dead. They began searching the camper thoroughly and found clothes for a young girl. This young girl, they estimated from the size of the clothes would have been 9 or 10. So they found no body for her. So they started searching, and one of the deputies felt blood dropping on its cap and or heard it and felt it. And him and his other deputy partner looked up, and they saw about 30 feet up in the air this young girl had been launched in a limb. Of course, she was dead, and she was estimated to have been about 9 or 10 years old, and she was severely mutilated and had been eaten on, is the way the story I heard it. So obviously something was not only just attacked these people, but they was feeding on them as well.
Yeah.
And then as the story goes, what I'd heard is the federal people came in and moved all these people out, basically told them to go, the police and everything, not to speak of what they had seen. And they were instructed to the deputies, along with state police and everything, to secure the park and close the park, which is very unusual. The park stays open 24 hours a day, 65 days a year. And the reason I know the park did close during that period was I ran a bait shop right at the Dover, Tennessee end of the park, which is right the first entrance to the lower peninsula of the land between the lakes. And I had several customers come back and ask me if I knew why the park had closed. And of course, I told them at the time I didn't know. I just said, I don't know why it's closed. I didn't know it was closed.
Yeah.
And so that's one bit of that I do remember from that period. And of course, keep in mind this was over 40 years ago, so I'm not certain of the exact date. I know it was in the spring, but I can't remember the exact date. Most people that I talk to and that do research and everything seem to think this occurred on April 7th of 1982. But the date is a little uncertain. And this being a 40-year-old code case, the chances of finding out the exact date of something that was basically purported to be covered up is going to be virtually impossible.
Yeah. And
another thing that I heard in the story that I'd heard is that they had 6 corners on this site. Of course, they didn't know initially what had killed these people. And so, to have 6 corners on site is pretty unusual for any kind of crime scene. You might have 1 or 2.
Right.
But one of these corners I had heard was from Memphis, Tennessee. And it was later confirmed to me by a retired law enforcement officer that if they were going to call a coroner in to look at a crime scene in this particular area, which covers West Tennessee and Southern Kentucky, it would be from Memphis, Tennessee. So that kind of confirms the story that I had heard. And I thought the story was interesting enough to where I decided to write a book about it.
Yeah. And it's crazy how it's been covered up all these years, and you only have a few witnesses that have come out to have that many people there. And there's other stories of the government coming in to, like with the missing Form 1 stuff with David Paulides in some of the other national parks and national recreation areas and stuff, with missing person cases. And the federal government, like the FBI and stuff, doesn't do missing person cases or like local murders like this typically. So it's really odd for the federal government to come in. And there are also reports that possibly they brought soldiers in from Fort Campbell.
Yes, and that is in my book as well. And this is the way that this creature was apprehended. As I mentioned, and I'll continue the story of my book as I heard it. It was approximately what I'd heard. It was middle of the night, 3 a.m. when they ran these The incident supposedly occurred right at dusk when this family, as best as they can estimate it, was killed, and it was right at dusk. And around 3 or 4 a.m., the exact time is uncleared. I'd heard like 3 or in the middle of the night. They did bring military units in. Now, these military units could have been from the 101st, which is a famous unit, or they were more than likely a special units, special forces unit that came in. One thing is clear that they did have military armament, military weaponry, and jeeps and trucks. And so after everybody was run out, they began hunting this creature, and they actually tracked it. And I had heard early that morning some of the people on the perimeter of the park. These were law enforcement officers such as Kentucky State Police and sheriff's deputies. Heard the reports from several automatic weapons going off. I mean, these weren't just one or two. There's several automatic weapons. They heard reports coming from deeper inside the land between the lakes at a pretty good distance, but they could still hear the reports.
Yeah. And
then actually some of the people that worked for what's called the Department of Natural Resources and everything were allowed back on the scene. They witnessed 8 soldiers. The story was 6 to 8 soldiers. I'm not sure exactly what it is. I believe I remember hearing 8 soldiers struggling to load a creature on the back of a deuce-and-a-half truck, which a deuce-and-a-half truck was a pretty common truck for the military. They built them for many years, and I have a picture of that in my book as well. 1980s deuce-and-a-half truck, or a flatbed trailer is what I had heard. Now, assuming the Army would probably not use a flatbed trailer, I would assume it was a deuce-and-a-half truck.
Yeah, the deuce-and-a-half are the ones that you always see in movies that have like the round canvas top on them.
6-wheel drive.
Yeah.
They've got 2 wheels in the front, and they've got a set of 2 sets of dualies in the rear. And the Army used these for many years, and they were trying to identify what this creature was. It had the head of a dog, very large creature. This was probably a more massive, or could have been considered the alpha dog of what's commonly referred to as dogmen. The term dogmen, I don't think really came along until the mid-90s.
Yeah.
People started calling these creatures that were being sighted, such as the Bray Road Beast, which is probably one of the more famous ones up in Pennsylvania, which has the head of a dog. They're roughly 7 feet tall. Some of these creatures are pretty massive. They're about 400 to 500 pounds. But they were loading this onto this Army vehicle, and this creature had a horrible smell. It literally, one thing I forgot to mention was that a lot of the emergency personnel that showed up on the scene of this camper were throwing up because the smell of the inside of the camper was very bad. And the witnesses witnessed the same smell with this creature that was being loaded on the back of this Army truck. It was described as the smell of death. It was literally that bad.
Yeah, that's interesting because they're also with a lot of Bigfoot sightings, especially down in Florida with the skunk ape. A lot of people describe like a wet dog smell or a really foul smell, like the smell of death. That's interesting. There with the story, there's one witness that has kind of come out, name and all, and her story has been told by a few different people. But she was a gas station attendant who 2 of the police officers come in and kind of told her what was going on.
Yes, and I have that in my book as well, because that's pretty well known. And she is deceased now. I never got the chance to meet this young lady. She was an older lady at that time, but she would have been a younger lady at the time this happened. Her name was Jan Thompson. She has written quite a bit on this incident. And I have talked to people who talked to her, and she was apparently a real credible witness, a real nice lady. She had been at the gas station, which was an all-night gas station in Grand Rivers, Kentucky. And these deputy sheriffs came in about 3 a.m. is the way I heard it. It could have been closer to 4, sometime in that time frame, and had talked to her. And one of them went by the pumps and threw up, and she knew something was wrong. She knew these gentlemen. They had been in her store many times, and to get coffee, as police officers will. And she knew something was wrong, but they eventually began to open up a little bit with what they had seen inside the park. And of course, it shook them up real bad. Any kind of a crime scene like this, where you have the carnage and literally marks left that are not left by something that would be a known creature.
Yeah.
There were claw marks on the inside of the camper that looked like a human hand. They had an opposing thumb. Now, there is no known creature. Bears have a rounded mark that they leave. If it's a bear attack, a coroner would easily be able to tell a coroner attack. But also in the back of the father's back, there were 4 deeper claw marks in it with an opposing thumb mark coming down along the side. And as people know, the only creatures that have opposing thumbs are ape-like creatures, only known creatures, I'll put it that way, and human hands.
Yeah.
Because that is why we were able to make everything that we're able to make, because we have opposing thumbs. And this is not a trait that's in the animal kingdom other than apes that we know of, and certainly not something that would have the head of a dog.
Yeah, yeah, and there have been other reports too of people being killed in the park as well, or being attacked. Yes,
many reports. I also have some of these in my book. Martin Groves has quite a few in his book. Martin Groves also did a second book. It's his second book. It's called Beasts Between the Rivers, A Trace of Death. He has many eyewitnesses' accounts of encounters with these creatures. I have a few surrounding in my book. One of the more famous ones is there was a young boy that had received a motorbike, and he really loved this motorbike, and he was riding it all over this area. And, he usually, the sound of the motorbike was, somebody riding a motorbike, with not throttle not open all the time, it's going up and down bumps and everything.
Yeah.
His sisters reported that they heard his motorbike wide open. It was not letting off of the throttle at all. Saw him jump over a hill and literally let the bike slide out from under him. He came into this house. He was so scared he couldn't even talk. And the young girls that had witnessed him come in on the motorbike and literally let it slide out from under him began to see something in the woods and hear something in the woods. And, of course, they were at home by themselves. They were older. Back in the earlier days, people would, even with, 14, 12-year-old girls, and boys, would often, be left alone if their mother was gone shopping or something, and they were mature enough to where they, knew how not to get in trouble. Some days I wonder nowadays if people are that mature, but at that age.
Yeah.
But they ran inside. They saw a creature with the head of a dog in the street lamp, and it was growling and yelling at them, and they ran inside and locked themselves in their mother's bedroom and with the door shut, and crawled under the bed. And they heard something break glass in the house and was making growling noises around it. About that time, fortunately, the mother came back up and was honking her horn because she wanted these children to assist her getting the groceries out of the station wagon. And they would not leave. They stayed in their room, in her room. They had gotten a couple of knives off the kitchen table and were holding those underneath the bed, and they were literally scared to death. And the mother came in, and they explained to them why they were under the bed and what had happened to them. And it's probably suspected that her, as the story goes, that her parents, or at least her mother, coming up in the car and blowing her horn had frightened this creature off.
Yeah.
And she did not see it, but later her father came home and saw where the window had been broken. And she was slowly but surely able to get these children to come down and help her with the groceries. But the mother didn't know what to think of the story, but the father, after he heard their story, he said, "I don't want you guys going out in the woods anymore. I've seen a pile of bones up near what was called, and I believe this was near an old lumber yard, if I'm not mistaken, in the area that they were in." And he said, "I don't want you going in the woods anymore." So that's one pretty famous story that came out of the area. The other is a group of Murray State University students were taking a little break and went down to the land between the lakes and were going to camp out there over the weekend. It was, I don't know whether it was between semesters or they were just taking a weekend break. And they had set up camp and had a campfire going up in the Upper Peninsula. And one of them had gone to use the bathroom, and he began to see eye shine, kind of a yellowish eye shine in a couple different places, and he started hearing noises. So he came back to the main campsite after he'd relieved himself there, and about that same time, the other students had begun to hear noises like something going through the woods all around them, and they were beginning to see the eye shine and hear low growls. And that was enough for them. They jumped back into, they were driving a VW microbus at that time, jumped back in it and took off and got the heck out of there. And as they were leaving, in the taillights, they could see a creature chasing this VW microbus. So it was very large, about 7 foot tall, and had the head of a dog. And it grabbed hold of the engine cowling on a VW microbus is in the rear, obviously, and it left deep scratch, literally torn into the engine cowling with the marks that were left on this. They didn't stop anywhere until they got back to the university. And they began to look, they felt relieved enough to get out of the van at that point and looked in the back, and they literally saw these claw marks on the back of their VW microbus. That's another famous story that's in my book that's in there.
I find it odd, and I don't know why, because like tales of like the Bell Witch and things like that, I've heard my whole life being, native Tennessean. And I find it odd that all these stories I never heard of until the past few years, because usually, it kind of makes its rounds, especially like local folklore and things. And going to, LBL my whole life and never being aware of this, I find it interesting that these stories kind of, I guess, have stayed in the area. And I find it interesting also that this massacre of this family, was kept pretty tight-lipped for a long time by what sounds like were a lot of people on scene when it happened.
Yes, and I think as a lot of these law enforcement officers got older and retired and stuff, they felt kind of an obligation to the family that had died. And there are some estimates that there are many more deaths in this area. Some, as I've heard, I think I put in my book possibly 16 or 17.
Yeah.
There are other estimates that put that even higher. But yes, I think this, of course, this is a purported story. I don't know 100% that it's true, and that's the way I listed in my book.
Right.
However, I think there are enough credible witnesses, and a lot of these witnesses are retired law enforcement officers that have come forward. And Martin Groves is a good example of that. He's a retired deputy. He kept this to himself for many years, and finally, I think some other researchers had talked to him and convinced him to come out about this incident. so yes, I think it was pretty much covered up. There would be a lot of business loss if, people didn't come into these areas. But at the same time, there are many more stories than what are in that I've listed in my book that have been around for many years. And the interesting thing about the story of the massacre is that this story basically has not changed in over 40 years. There are people that argue about exactly what this creature was, whether it was a Dogman or, whether it was a part Dogman, Bigfoot type entity. But the basics of the story have not changed, and that is 4 people were killed at this campsite. The interesting thing about this is, and of course I've been up to this area quite a bit, just looking it over and doing research, is you can definitely tell there were paved roads there. I found pieces of pavement, a whole piece of pavement that went across the road. There were bathrooms and showers in this area. You can see the foundations. They literally tore these things out. And if you were going to close down a campground because it wasn't making money or whatever, you would just close it down. Why would you go in and completely wipe a campsite out? That's another thing that kind of supports the story because of the fact that the campsites were not simply closed, they were removed.
Right.
Literally with the bulldozer.
Yeah. And you're talking about a place that still has many campsites to this day, and there's lots of people that go camping up there, and there's lots of recreation and boating and fishing, and this is a place that's really well used in the warmer months of the year for sure. Absolutely, and particularly in the early 80s, there were many more campsites in this area than there are now, particularly in the Upper Peninsula. Now, there are still boat ramps and stuff there, but even on, there's one particular area which is called the Mumbers Bay, which I have this story in my book as well, but it's pretty well-known story, and it was witnessed by a DNR, Kentucky wildlife officer, was in his boat. He was not on duty at the time. He was fishing the area up into Mumbers Bay. It was, I think it occurred early in the morning, and he saw a creature he could not identify stalking a young couple who had a tent down at the Mumbers Bay. And this creature was stalking and getting closer, and he was some distance in his boat, but he could see the creature clearly. He described the creature as a dog-like creature, but had shoulders and was large. And he described the face of this creature being more hyena-like, than a dog, a flatter face. Yeah.
But he yelled at this couple trying to get their attention. Well, he did initially get their attention. They were looking at him, but they were not understanding what he was trying to tell them, and he witnessed this creature attack and kill them.
Wow.
Literally on sight at this tent. And the story goes that, this creature was actually just chucking large chunks of flesh out of him and pulling it out with his teeth. And he was literally in shock and let his boat drift for a while before he could come back to his senses with what he had seen.
Yeah.
But this story was purportedly covered up as well.
Yeah, and because if these stories were to get out and like the murder of that family and, would get press coverage, then it makes sense why they want to cover it up, because who would want to go to this area if there's this unknown beast going around just tearing people apart and stalking them, like you said, out of nowhere. They're getting attacked and just massacred.
Exactly. And this is not something you definitely want to get out. Now, the other thing about this is you have areas such as the Bray Road Beast, which is a well-known, that's probably more famous than what's referred to as the LBL Beast. Where they have spotted this, a lot of people call them werewolf-like creature. They're commonly referred to nowadays as Dogmen.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned earlier, the Shawnees called them wolfmen in the 1600s. from witnesses. And, generally the Shawnee Indians or any Indians, they pretty much tell it the way it is. These people don't lie.
Right.
They know they were more attuned with nature than any of us will be because, we're a modern society and used to going to grocery stores and stuff. But back in those days, men had to live off the land. They weren't, there weren't grocery stores and convenience stores and stuff you could run down to and get a pack of Cokes and some ham sandwiches. So they lived off the land. They knew the land and were in tune with nature. So when you have credible, stories like this that happened even dating back to the 1600s, usually as the old saying goes, usually where there's smoke, there's a flame. So these creatures, I believe, are out there, and people that are credible witnesses, such as Martin Groves and others that have come out, they're not all seeing stuff. These things are out there.
Yeah, and the fact, I don't think any of these witnesses really have anything to gain. Like the lady who worked at the gas station and the police that have come forward, after retiring, like Martin Groves and other police officers about the massacre of the family. None of those people have anything to gain. And it makes sense why they would wait, until they're retired, because as a police officer, their credibility is a lot because they have to go to court and, testify and things like that. So people shooting their, story like that come out and them telling it kind of shoot their credibility all to hell. But yeah, I can understand why these people would hold on to the story. And then also probably being threatened by the government as well, with the government coming in and covering things up.
Absolutely. And their livelihoods, literally their livelihoods were at stake. This is the way these law enforcement officers support themselves.
Yeah.
And they have children and wives and families just like everyone else. And this is their trade. They know what they do. And that's the way they make their living. And I'm sure that, if you're told basically to shut up and not to speak about it, and you realize your job is in jeopardy, of course you're not going to say anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the good thing about these credible people that have come out after the fact is they feel an obligation to warn people that, these creatures, exist. They have witnessed them themselves. Once again, Martin Grove being one of the most credible witnesses who has spoke all over the country, literally, at conferences and everything. He seemed to indicate from his story, and Martin Groves and I are very good friends. I've spoke to him many times. We've actually interviewed a couple of people, on different occasions that have had witnessed different things. He literally indicated that it looked like in the case of his attack that Bigfoots, because he saw two different creatures that night, that Bigfoots were actually working in coordination with these dog-like creatures.
Yeah.
Much like a man will take a dog, a good squirrel dog, or a good coon hound, or a good rabbit dog, and literally tree or chase the animals back to them. In the case of a rabbit, if anybody who's ever been rabbit hunting knows that if you jump a rabbit with a dog, you stay right where you are, because the dog is going to chase that rabbit, and that rabbit is going to make a complete circle and come back to where you were. I've killed many rabbits that way. He's going to come right back to the spot where he was initially jumped.
Yeah.
And so, what he has in his book indicates that there may have been cooperation with it, because he also spotted Bigfoot-type creatures. These creatures he thought were men in ghillie suits at first, until they came in closer and surrounded him and his deputy partner. His deputy partner was literally scared so bad he had a stroke and was never able to work again on the night that they were surrounded.
Wow.
So, yeah, there is a possibility that, you have Bigfoot. Most of the stories I've heard are that Bigfoots and Dogmen tolerate each other, but they're not necessarily friends. But in this case, there may be some instances where these creatures are actually working together.
Yeah.
Which is a really frightening thought when you sit down and contemplate that.
Yeah, to have those bigger creatures possibly out stalking humans. Yeah, it's pretty horrifying.
Yeah, that's not something that would probably be one of your worst nightmares, to wake up to, because these creatures, dogmen, as they're commonly referred to nowadays, are known to be very quick animals. There is a report of a federal officer that had clocked one of these animals killing just happened to be in the right place at the right time, killing a white-tailed deer, and the equipment he had with him at the time clocked this creature achieving a speed of 47 miles an hour on all fours.
Wow.
So, if you get something that can go 47 miles an hour, basically 56 kilometers an hour, whichever way you want to look at it, you're not going to escape these creatures should they, decide to make a meal out of you.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a lot of, in the Bigfoot Dogman community, there's a lot of, you have people who believe that they're flesh and blood creatures, and then you have people that believe they come through portals, they're interdimensional. And, hearing stories like this, I don't care what they are. If they can kill you, they can kill you. It doesn't matter if they came through a portal or not. Obviously with these stories, they're somewhat flesh and blood and out hunting animals and people.
Yes, and there is portal theories and things that I've heard. I generally, I'm not denying the existence of portals. I was an engineer for many years, so I understand a little bit of physics, and I understand that there is a possibility of portals between dimensions and everything. But in the cases of these creatures, I believe they are living, breeding populations that are in this area. One witness had reported going down through the land between the lakes late at night and had literally had to slam on his brakes because there was a upright dog creature walking, and behind it were three little smaller versions of it that were behind it. He turned his high beams on, and this thing turned around and looked at him. It was a little bit smaller. It was a female, he would assume, with the three pups swallowing it, and literally looked at him. It was about 6 foot tall, and he could hear these little pups making noises as they were crossing the what's called the trace, is the main road between the land between the lakes. If anybody that's been down there, they call this the trace.
Yeah.
Goes all the way from Kentucky to Tennessee, down to Dover, Tennessee, or vice versa, on up to Grand Rivers, Kentucky. And this seemed to be a credible witness too. That so this would indicate there is a breeding population of these creatures in this area. There's another account. Martin details this in his second book, and I had heard this story back a few years ago indirectly. But there was a gentleman that was mowing for the work for the TVA at the time that had an enclosed mower. You've seen these mower tractors alongside the road that have the bush hogs on them.
Yeah.
He had a bush hog on the back of his, and he hit something that he didn't know what it was. He knew he hit something. They had him mowing a field that had grown up, fairly high, about 4 or 5 feet, and obviously you couldn't see anything down in the high weeds that were up. And then just a few minutes later, a creature began banging on the cab of his tractor, which appeared to be a female dog that was standing on 2 feet and was trying its best to get into his tractor.
Oh, wow.
And get a hold of him.
Yeah.
And he turned his tractor toward the creature where the back wheels would have run over it, fairly quickly, as quickly as you can get a bush hog to turn. And that scared the creature off because it almost got caught under the wheels. But he described this as being an upright standing dog-like creature about 6 foot tall that seemed very pissed off. And the speculation is, I don't know whether he went back and looked or whatever, but that he had hit one of these baby creatures that this female dogman had just given birth to. And that's a pretty well-known story. And I heard the story indirectly, I think, from probably one of the people that worked in the land between the lakes at the time. I was over at my brother-in-law's house, and he was talking about this. I was not directly involved in conversation, but I was very close to it. And I kind of stopped what I was doing and listened. And I was a little skeptical at that time, and I just kind of thought, well, that seems like a far-fetched story, but with credible witnesses that have come forward now, I realize some of these stories are not far-fetched.
Right. It kind of blows my mind to think that there are things out there like this, because we always like to think of ourselves as top of the food chain and we're smarter than other creatures and things. And so, yeah, it's kind of scary to believe that these things are out there, hunting people down, and all these stories dating back, like you're saying, to the 1600s. With the Native Americans and things. And this is all reasons why I tell my audience that I do not go camping. I'm not a camper. And now if I stayed in a camper, maybe I might feel a little more safe. And going into the LBL, with it not being a national park, you can at least carry a gun in there. And so I would definitely be armed if I ever stayed. I've never stayed in the LBL. We always just go there during the daytime and visit. But with one of my favorite restaurants is Patty's 1800s Settlement in Grand Rivers, and so we usually go through Land Between Lakes and kind of eat lunch up there and then come back. But
that is a great place to eat. My wife and I have eaten there several times. That is anybody that's got to go up the Grand Rivers has got to eat at Patty's 1800 Settlement. That is some of the best food around.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's the bread that they make. They make it in flower pots, and they make their own butter and. They make their own mozzarella cheese sticks. Everything's just amazing there. But yeah, that's one of our favorite restaurants that we go to. But yeah, now it makes me think, okay, well, this summer when we go up there, I don't want to be up there after dark. We'll definitely come back down the trace and come back through Dover before dark. Yeah.
Now, the carrying guns is kind of a two-edged sword in the LBL. They say you're not supposed to unless you're hunting, and it's supposed to be type specific to what you're hunting. But I have read and I have heard that they are a little lenient if you've got a concealed carry permit and you have a pistol or something, that they're not going to harass you, because this is a pretty wild area. And as I mentioned in my book, when I'm in the woods, I like going armed, because you never know if you're going to run across a rabid fox, which can be very aggressive, or, with rabies, being pretty rampant in certain times of the year.
Yeah.
You want to protect yourself in the wild. I mean, because as you mentioned before, we are not, at least in the woods, we are not necessarily the apex predator. And certainly if these things do exist, I would consider them an apex predator.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing about this is several witnesses have reported these things make sniffing noises. Murray State students that encountered these creatures back in the 70s literally reported they heard these things smelling. So if you sat and sniffing, as if they were sniffing what they were eating, I think they had hot dogs and grilled them on the open fire at the campsite there. And if you take a creature with the senses of a wolf has 100 times the sense of smell that a human being does.
Yeah.
Chances are these creatures are going to know you're around long before you ever realize they're around. And if they don't want to be seen or heard, you're never going to realize that they were even there. They could have been looking at you the whole time and you would never really have realized it.
Yeah.
Because with their sense of smell, and obviously they're more attuned to the nature than we will be, being domesticated humans. Chances are they could be looking at you for a half a day and out of curiosity or for whatever reason, and you'd never know they were there. So it's a creature that is well adapted to its environment, very fast, very lethal, probably the apex predator, along with Bigfoot in these areas, and they're king of their territories.
Yeah. Yeah, just like, there's other predators as well, that you're saying that are attuned, like mountain lions. You'll never know mountain lions or bobcats are around, but they're always around, and you'll never see them. And a lot of times, I mean, if you're walking through the woods, there's wildlife all around you, deer and everything, and you'll never see or hear a lot of it because, like you're saying, they're attuned to their environment. And so, Bigfoot or these dogmen, they're going to be very well attuned to their environment as well, and very well versed in staying hidden if they don't want you to see them.
Exactly, and that's the thing. I mean, it's going to be a rare case that you see these unless I also have a theory about this. This is just my personal theory. I have a theory that if you go into these areas, chances are, and by far, the majority of people will never witness one of these creatures, whether it's Bigfoot or Dogman. However, I believe these animals are territorial. I think you're at more risk if you go in and set up a tent and stay for more than a few days, or you go in and set up a camper in one of these remote areas. I believe these creatures are territorial. They look at it as if, you're trying to move into their territory, and they don't necessarily appreciate it. Now, they may try. One thing I base this theory on is the account of Martin Groves with the firefighter that was allegedly killed in the land between the lakes. It was generally publicized that he was killed by, a bear, but there have not been bears in the land between the lakes over the past 100 years. Now, they may be moving in. I don't doubt that there are a few down there. But bears don't drag their victims 150 or 200 yards away from the tent to feed on. They will cover them with branches and limbs. They don't drag them off from the initial kill site more than a few feet. So this particular gentleman that Martin had met, and he identified him as the person he had met because of his truck. They saw his truck being towed out. Had indicated the day before that and warned Martin that he needed to keep his food up and stuff. He thought maybe that he had heard noises in the brush and thought maybe that there was a bear or something was, kind of surrounded him or stalking him before he was killed. So based on this and other ideals that I have, I believe that these creatures will tend to be more aggressive if you set up in their territory and stay a few days.
Yeah.
That might be, they might try to run you out. So they might try to make noise. They might try to give you little glimpses of them and stuff. That's your warning there. As the comedian says, Jeff Foxworthy, here's your clue. If you start witnessing this activity around, pack up and leave.
Yeah.
Don't stick around for what might happen.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Steve. Really fascinating story and really fascinating eyewitness cases.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I've enjoyed it quite a bit. And anybody that's interested in reading my book, it's available on Amazon. It's called The LBL Massacre. And I appreciate you reading my book. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, I found that. Yeah, it's great. I love how you started out with telling the story of your family living in the area and connecting yourself to the area and being a native to that area and living around there. I like the firsthand accounts because you can, a lot of people will go into areas and research, but the fact that you live there, the area, I just think adds more to the story that you can, describe the area a lot better than a lot of people who aren't familiar with it.
Yes, sir. On and on through the years, I've spent quite a bit of time there. As a matter of fact, this was not in my book, but I'll give you one more before we close. My brother, and I didn't know this till years after my sister-in-law told me about this, but when I was a young kid down in the land between the lakes, he occasionally would take me out to run his trot lines. He fished right because the lake was only about 3/4 of a mile behind our house, and he had an old John boat back there back in the 60s. And he took me a couple of times, and I really enjoyed it, but he quit taking me. But I learned later from my sister-in-law the reason he quit taking me is he was walking to his boat with his lines ready to put out some trot lines for fishing, and he passed by a creature about 100 to 200 feet away from him, and they just stared at each other. He said this was not a human creature. He said it had the body of a man, but it was not human. And they looked at each other a few minutes. He took off in the same direction he was going, and the creature took off in a different direction.
Wow.
So, yeah, there's some interesting things there, even back, when I was a kid.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thanks again, Steve, for coming on.
All right. I certainly do appreciate it.
All right, everybody. Y'all stay safe out there. Have a good day. We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to The Unseen Paranormal. Join me next Wednesday with a brand new guest. And please rate, review, share, and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. This helps more people discover the show. You can connect with me over on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or join us in the Unseen Paranormal Lounge group on Facebook. Until next time, remember, some of the scariest things are unseen.